Welcome to the Deep Dive. We cut through the noise to get you the essential understanding from, well, some really important sources. Today, we're diving into something pretty complex and, frankly, urgent. It's the heightened national security situation right here in the U.S. This follows those recent military actions by the U.S. and Israel against Iran's nuclear program. Things are moving fast, and it has real implications for us at home. We're here to help you unpack it.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've pulled together quite a range of material. We're looking at official bulletins, from DHS and the FBI, but also news reports from places like Fox News, CBS, Dev Discourse, NBC, plus analyses from groups like the ICCT, the Council on Foreign Relations, and even a statement from the Justice Department. So the goal here is really to pull out the key insights, help you understand the threats as they're evolving, and importantly, how U.S. agencies are trying to respond.
Okay, let's jump right in. The sources all point to these military strikes as the starting point, the catalyst. Can you walk us through what happened?
Sure. It starts with something called Operation Midnight Hammer. This was the U.S. military strike, June 21st, 22nd, 2025. The U.S. basically joined in with Israel, who'd already conducted some attacks earlier, around June 13th. And the targets were very specific. 3 major Iranian nuclear facilities. We're talking Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan.
And this wasn't minor, right? The scale of it.
No, definitely not minor. It involved, I think the number was 125 aircraft. That includes B-2 bombers, the ones carrying those bunker buster bombs, designed to hit deeply buried targets. And the initial reports, they talked about extremely severe damage and destruction. So a very significant hit.
Right. So how did Iran react to, well, having its key nuclear sites hit like that?
Their reaction was pretty much immediate and strong. They condemned it, obviously. Iran's Atomic Energy Organization called it a barbaric violation of international law.
Yeah.
And they vowed retaliation. This wasn't just bluster either. Yep. Because on June 23rd, so just a day after the U.S. strikes wrapped up, Iran fired ballistic missiles, directly targeted a U.S. airbase in Qatar. And to really drive the point home, Iranian state TV apparently declared that every American, citizen or soldier in the Middle East was now a legitimate target.
Wow. That is incredibly aggressive language. But wait, didn't President Trump announce a ceasefire pretty soon after? How does that square with missile attacks and these kinds of threats?
Yeah, it's a really tense, dynamic situation. You're right. President Trump did announce a ceasefire between Israel and Iran later on, and thankfully that seems to be holding for now. But that direct missile strike on the U.S. base before the ceasefire, that really changes things. It shows Iran is willing to hit back directly at U.S. assets, even while other things are developing.
Okay, so that sets the international stage. But the big question for everyone listening is, what does this actually mean for us, right here in the United States?
Right. And that's where the focus shifts domestically pretty quickly. The sources show that just hours after President Trump spoke about the strikes, DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, issued a National Terrorism Advisory System bulletin. This was June 22nd. And it explicitly warned of a heightened threat environment right here inside the U.S.
So a direct link between the overseas action and the threat level at home. What kind of threats are they generally worried about?
Well, the bulletins cover some general ground first. It mentions, how major groups like Al-Qaeda, AQIP, ISIS, they've been calling for attacks against the U.S. anyway, especially since the October 7th Hamas attack. And there's been a concerning rise in threats against the Jewish community, both globally and here. But then it gets specific about Iran.
Okay, what are the Iran-specific concerns?
There are several key areas DHS and other experts are flagging. First up, cyberattacks. DHS is warning about the likelihood of, quote, low-level cyber attacks against U.S. networks by pro-Iranian hacktivists, but also potentially more serious attacks from cyber actors affiliated with the Iranian government.
So more than just nuisance attacks?
Potentially, yes. The concern is these actors are constantly probing U.S. networks, looking for poorly secured systems, internet-connected devices, essentially mapping things out. Iran is believed to have the capability to actually sabotage infrastructure, both public and private. So it's this sort of persistent background cyber threat that could escalate.
Okay, cyber attacks. What else?
Second, targeting specific people, officials and critics. Iran has what sources call a long-standing commitment to target U.S. government officials, particularly those they blame for the death of General Soleimani back in 2020. And this isn't theoretical. We've seen plots disrupted, like the 2022 attempt against John Bolton, the former national security advisor, or a 2023 plot against a U.S. citizen who was critical of the regime. Even going back to the 2011, a plot to kill the Saudi ambassador here.
So these are active, ongoing efforts.
Seems like it. Former FBI Director Wray even recently called a murder-for-hire plot involving a Pakistani national straight out of the Iranian playbook. It shows a persistent strategic focus on retaliation against individuals.
All right, what's the third area?
Third is the risk from lone actors or maybe small cells already here in the U.S. The bulletin specifically warns that the chance of violent extremists in the homeland independently mobilizing to violence goes up, especially if, and this is key, Iranian leadership were to issue some kind of religious ruling, a fatwa maybe, calling for retaliation. That could act as a trigger.
A green light, essentially, making it harder to predict.
Exactly. Much harder than state-directed plots. Fourth, there's critical infrastructure. Experts point to things like electrical grids, medical facilities, transport hubs in major cities as potential targets. And what's concerning is the mention of adversaries using satellite mapping for pre-operational surveillance. They're looking closely at these targets.
Wow. Okay, and you said there was one more?
Yes. Finally, the advisory warns about U.S.-based individuals plotting additional attacks. This could be against pro-Israel targets or U.S. government and military officials, often driven by anti-Semitic or anti-Israel feelings, spurred on by the broader conflict, so it widens the threat landscape quite a bit.
Those are some really sobering warnings. Now, digging deeper into the sources, there's this whole discussion around a potential vulnerability, something that's often debated. Border security. What are the experts saying there?
Right. This is where, as you said, it gets complex and definitely a point of significant concern raised in some of our sources, particularly from former officials. People like former FBI official Chris Swecker and Homeland Security experts Michael Balboni, Tom Homan. They're suggesting that what they term open borders could make the terror cell threat worse.
Okay, open borders is a charged term, but what's the specific link they're making to Iran?
Well, they point to, for example, Swecker mentioned this, thousands of Iranian nationals previously crossing over the border. The concern he raised is that these individuals could potentially be leveraged, maybe as U.S. terror sleeper cells. He even said, quote, "We missed an opportunity when they caught and released those 1,000, suggesting a failure to gather needed intelligence."
So the worry is less about the numbers themselves and more about not knowing who these individuals are or what their connections might be.
That seems to be the core of it, yes. Michael Balboni put it quite starkly, saying tens of millions of people came across, and we don't know who they are, where they came from, what their capabilities are, or their intentions. It highlights this perceived information gap, this blind spot that they argue is a major security risk. And it's not just theoretical. After these recent strikes, ICE reportedly arrested 15 Iranians, which seems to underscore this ongoing concern.
It's clear Iran isn't just about direct confrontation then. The sources talk a lot about their operational strategy being quite indirect. How does that work?
That's a really important point. Iran definitely shows, as the sources put it, a clear preference for plots that employ intermediaries. Why? To maintain reasonable deniability. They use cutouts. This could be criminals, maybe dual nationals with links to militant groups. They've even been known to leverage, international drug traffickers to low-level crooks.
Using criminals to do state bidding, essentially.
Exactly. It makes it much harder to trace an attack directly back to Tehran. It complicates the intelligence picture and any potential response.
The sources had some really vivid examples of this, especially in Europe. Can you share a few?
Yeah, there are quite a few, and they really illustrate the method. Remember the 2018 bomb plot foiled outside Paris? That actually led to an Iranian diplomat being convicted. So direct state ties there. Then in 2022, there was an IRGC plot, codenamed The Wedding, quite chillingly. They hired a people smuggler to try and assassinate 2 Iran international news anchors in London.
Using a people smuggler for an assassination.
Yes. And in 2021, maybe even more striking, the IRGC apparently hired a fugitive Hells Angels gang leader to organize attacks on synagogues in Germany. More recently, 2024, organized crime groups, names like Foxtrot and Rumba were mentioned, were used for attacks on Israeli embassies in Stockholm and Brussels.
So bikers, smugglers, organized crime.
It's a diverse network, and it's not just plots. In 2023, the UK Security Minister, Tom Tugendhat, warned that Iran was actually hiring criminal gangs in the UK just to spy on Jewish individuals, potentially for future assassination campaigns.
That's incredible. It really paints a picture of asymmetric warfare using unconventional means. How does this preference translate to potential threats here?
Well, it means the threat isn't just a missile strike or a state cyber team. It's potentially activating individuals or groups already here, or exploiting existing criminal pathways into the country or within it. It makes the threat much more diffuse, harder to pin down. And beyond these criminal networks, we absolutely have to mention Iran's main strategic partner, Lebanese Hezbollah.
Right, Hezbollah.
They have a long, violent history targeting the U.S. and U.S. interests. They certainly have the capability to carry out retaliatory attacks, maybe against former officials, either overseas or potentially even here in the U.S. Plus, Iran continues to back groups like Hamas and the Houthis, who are also actively hostile to U.S. interests.
Okay, so given this complex, multifaceted threat picture, how are U.S. agencies like the FBI adapting? What are the sources saying about their response?
Well, the FBI seems to be definitely stepping up vigilance. Sources report they're reallocating resources, specifically shifting agents away from some immigration enforcement tasks and refocusing them onto counterterrorism, counterintelligence, and cybersecurity, particularly related to Iran. This shift is reportedly happening in major field offices: Chicago, L.A., San Francisco, New York, Philly. It suggests a significant nationwide adjustment.
Is this shift happening smoothly, or are there maybe internal debates about these priorities?
It seems there might be some internal friction, yeah. Some sources mention complaints from within the FBI, from employees who feel they're being pulled off vital counterterrorism or counterintelligence work, pulled off to, quote, maximize the number of immigration arrests. So it suggests a potential tension, a debate about where the focus should really be.
Interesting. And didn't one of the former officials you mentioned earlier comment on this?
Yes. Chris Wecker, the former FBI assistant director, he offered a pretty critical perspective. He argued the Bureau had been, in his view, too focused on domestic terrorists like white supremacists and right-wing extremists. His point was that, especially with foreign adversaries flowing into the country, the focus should have remained more squarely on international threats. It definitely highlights an ongoing debate about resource allocation and strategic priorities. Of course, the FBI's official stance is that they continuously assess and realign resources to meet the most pressing threats. So they'd say they are adapting.
All right, bringing this all back home to you, our listener, with all this information, what can people actually do? Are there practical steps recommended?
Definitely. It really comes back to that core message of public awareness and vigilance. The "if you see something, say something" campaign. It sounds simple, but authorities stress its importance. Reporting genuinely suspicious activity, unattended bags, people may be lurking or acting strangely, especially around public gatherings or houses of worship. It matters. In this environment, that public vigilance is a real layer of security.
So being aware of your surroundings.
Exactly. And then there's the cyber side. The advice there is pretty consistent. Use strong passwords. Definitely enable two-factor authentication wherever you can. Keep your software updated. Be cautious on public Wi-Fi. Encrypt sensitive data if possible. And just be really skeptical of suspicious emails or attachments. Basic cyber hygiene goes a long way against those threats we talked about.
Okay, so to quickly recap the key takeaways from our deep dive today. We're facing an immediate threat from Iran, one that goes way beyond just military tit-for-tat. They use diverse, often unconventional tactics cyber, targeting individuals, potentially lone actors, and critically, leveraging these intermediary networks, including criminal ones. We've also touched on identified vulnerabilities, like the concerns raised about border security and how U.S. agencies are trying to adapt, though maybe with some internal debate.
That's a good summary, and if you connect it all to the bigger picture, what you see is the U.S. and its allies dealing with an adversary, Iran, that's willing and able to hit back using asymmetric tactics. Even after being hit hard militarily, they can use proxies, criminal networks, cyber means to strike overseas, and yes, potentially here at home. It's a constantly shifting, complex challenge.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. In this world where state-sponsored threats increasingly use these unconventional methods, blending in with existing societal pathways like crime or migration, what measures, maybe beyond what we even discussed today, are most crucial for our security agencies to prioritize? Something to think about. Keep exploring that interplay between global events, security at the border, and safety right here. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.